Let us pray for illumination as we listen for what the Spirit is saying to the church today. Creator God, you are the Lord of the harvest, for from you comes all good things. May we remember that without you we have nothing. Inspire us with generosity, so that we may be the people of your harvest, sharing the blessing that you have given us with others. Amen.
Today is a day of praise. Today is a day of thanksgiving. We've marked it as the day when we celebrate the harvest in all its forms, a day when we give thanks to God for all the good things that God has given to us. In the Hebrew Bible, the most extravagant praise of God is found in the Psalms. And we have two Psalms this morning. The first was hidden behind the first hymn that we sung, "The King of Love My Shepherd Is." That hymn is based on Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd," which is the psalm set by the lectionary for today. It is a psalm of trust, expressing the absolute confidence that God is with us. We are like sheep. God is like the shepherd. God leads us through this life, giving us quiet places to rest. And when times are not quite so quiet, when we are in the narrow valley, afraid of what the shadows might hold, then God is still with us. Psalm 23 ends with a joyous feast of abundance. A banquet table is prepared for us, cups overflowing. After the service and the meeting today, we'll be having a congregational lunch. Maybe we won't have overflowing cups and tables full of food, but I'm sure it's going to be a rich feast of love and fellowship. And any visitors are invited to stay for the meal. We can express thanks in many ways. In Psalm 23, thanks is embodied in the confidence of the speaker, the confidence that God is always with them. More often, perhaps, we think of thanks with words. The other psalm that I've chosen for this morning is Psalm 65, and it's one like that. It is a psalm of thanksgiving for an abundant harvest. Yet it takes a broader view of what the harvest means. And you may be able to hear some echoes of Psalm 23 in its words.
So reading from Psalm 65. Praise is due to you, O God in Zion, and to you shall vows be performed. O you who answered prayer, to you all flesh shall come. When deeds of iniquity overwhelm us, you forgive our transgressions. And happy are those whom you choose and bring near to live in your courts. We shall be satisfied with the goodness of your house, your holy temple. By awesome deeds you answer us with deliverance, O God of our salvation. You are the hope of all the ends of the earth and of the farthest seas. By your strength you establish the mountains. You are girded with might. You silence the roaring of the seas, the roaring of their waves, and the tumult of the peoples. Those who live at earth's farthest bounds are awed by your signs. You make the gateways of the morning and the evening shout for joy. You visit the earth and water it. You greatly enrich it. The river of God is full of water, and you provide the people with grain, for you have prepared it. You water its furrows abundantly, settling its ridges, softening it with showers and blessing its growth. You crown the year with your bounty. Your wagon tracks overflow with richness. The pastures of the wilderness overflow, and the hills gird themselves with joy. The meadows clothe themselves with flocks, and the valleys deck themselves with grain. They shout and sing together for joy.
In Psalm 65 we hear the meadows clothe themselves with flocks, the valleys deck themselves with grain, they shout and sing together for joy. Imagine the people in an agricultural village in ancient Israel at the end of a good season. The rains have come on time and been enough. As time goes on, they look out and see the grain growing in the fields that they've planted, their flocks ready to lamb, and plenty of pasture for grazing. Hope and joy begin to well up in their hearts. But the time for celebration is not quite yet. They must wait for the harvest. They pray to God that things will go well, that the myriad of factors that make for a good year, the rain and the sun, locusts, winds and so on, will continue to be beneficial. Then it comes time for the harvest, and the yield is what is expected and more. Then they breathe a sigh of relief, food for another year, good seed crops for next year, and plenty in excess for trade. Then the hope and expectation they have held are released. Joy breaks forth. They come to worship God, bringing the first fruits of the harvest. They sing a psalm like the one we heard this morning, praising God who has brought the rains. And more. They praise God for more. The farmers have worked hard in the field, ploughing, planting, weeding, keeping the flock safe from wolves, leading them to pasture. Yet the villagers realize that they on their own are not responsible for the success of the harvest. God has aided the community, just as God cared for the individual in the 23rd Psalm. The rains and the sun are beyond human control. They are God's contribution. So they sing thanks to God. The intricate delicacy of the rains, just the right amount at the right time, reminds them of other examples of God's work. The singers remember the many times that God has aided the people. By awesome deeds you answer us with deliverance, they sing. The singers remember God's powerful deeds in creating the world, establishing the mountains and the seas. The gifts of rain in seasons past, just the right amount at the right time, ranks alongside this awesome work. They see that God's awesome deeds are not just for them, but for the whole of creation. And so in the psalm, they imagine the mountains and the valleys singing alongside them in joy. They imagine that their song joins with the voices of all the people in the world, those who live at the farthest edges of the earth. And they go beyond this to imagine the cosmos itself singing at the harvest. The gateways of the morning and the evening, dawn and dusk, shout for joy. Today, we stand alongside those ancient farmers to praise and thank God for the good things we have received in our lives. Of course, there are some differences. Harvest is tied to autumn, which varies depending on where you are. In ancient Israel, it was September, October. In Australia, around now. And that makes it different from the other festivals we celebrate because they are based on the days of the calendar year. So Christmas is always in December and Easter and Lent in the first part of the year. But that's a fairly trivial difference. For us these days, there are other differences. Harvest Thanksgiving is not so much about farming. The festival for us is almost entirely symbolic. We are not an agricultural community. We are city dwellers. Our first fruits do not come once a year with a harvest or a lambing season. Our harvest is more likely a periodic payment from our employer or superannuation fund or investments. Many of us grew up on the land, but we now live in the city. We don't have the same sort of link with the land. Usually we bring our equivalent of the first fruits in the form of the offering every week, not just at harvest. But today we symbolically bring food products, the staples of life, and lay them at the front of the church. These products remind us that the gifts of God that God has given to us extend beyond just money to all our material goods and our comfortable lifestyle. And perhaps too we should bring other gifts, lumps of iron ore to celebrate the mountains of minerals that God has left in this land, or bottles of natural gas. It's been in the news recently that Australia is soon to be the greatest producer of natural gas in the world. Or perhaps pictures of the wonders of this land, Uluru, the Great Barrier Reef, perhaps a shot of the Fringe. Our harvest in Australia is not just one of agriculture, but of mining and tourism and other industries. For us, those who live at Earth's farthest bounds are awed by our natural wonders and come to visit us. Now, I have a small exercise in thanks for you. You should all have received a pink card. Is that right? And if not, we've got a couple of spares that we can give out. A little pink card that says on one side, thanks. And there should be pens near you in the pews. Or as they say in the airlines, your closest pen may be behind you. But there should be pens scattered around the pews. So I invite you to reflect for a moment. Think of one thing that has happened in the past year that you give thanks for, and write that on the back of your card. Hold on to your card then, because we'll bring it forward with our thanks offerings and produce later in the service. So please, take a moment, reflect on the year and give thanks for something in that year. Our second reading is from the Gospel according to John. It's a fairly long reading. I thought about trying to trim it down, but it's a story with several episodes, one after the other, and it doesn't lend itself to trimming. The story starts out with sight being given by Jesus to a man who had been born blind. So sometimes people call it the healing of the blind man. But that bit of the story takes only 7 verses. There are 34 more verses to the story, so we're talking about the healing taking less than 25% of the story. The rest of the story is about how people respond to the miracle. And there's a variety of characters: Jesus, the blind man, his family, his neighbours, the Jews. So perhaps we should call it a story about how people respond to good things that happen. A story about giving thanks, or not giving thanks for God's blessings, as the case may be.
The Gospel reading is from John chapter 9, verses 1 to 41. As Jesus walked along, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but so that God's works might be revealed in him, it is necessary for us to work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. And as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva, and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. Then he went and washed and came back and was able to see. The neighbours and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some were saying, "It is he." Others were saying, "No, but it's someone like him." He kept saying, "But I am the man." But they kept asking him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" And he answered, "A man called Jesus made mud. He spread it on my eyes and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' Then I went and washed, and I received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know." They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been formerly blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, "He put mud on my eyes. Then I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?" And they were divided. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened." And he said, "He is a prophet." Well, the Jews did not believe that he had been blind and received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight, and he asked them, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" And his parents answered, "We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind, but we do not know how it is that now he sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the leader of the Jews, for the leaders had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, "He is of age. Ask him." So for the second time they called the man who had been blind and said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." He answered, "I do not know whether he is a sinner, but one thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" And he answered them, "I've told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" Then they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from." The man answered, "Here is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered him, "You were born entirely in sins, and you are trying to teach us?" And they drove him out. Jesus heard that they had driven him out. And when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir? Tell me, so that I may believe in him." And Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he." And he said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshipped him. Jesus said, "I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees near him heard this and said to him, "Surely we are not blind, are we?" And Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would not have sin. But now you say, 'We see,' so your sin remains." In sacred words of old, we have heard the Spirit speak anew.
Today is a day of thanksgiving and praise, but there's a flip side to thanksgiving and praise: sadness and lament. Those ancient farmers in Israel celebrated the good harvest, but they also knew that not all harvests were good. They knew that not all years were years of abundance. They knew of droughts and locusts, of sickness and marauding, invading armies. We look at those things that we give thanks to God for, but we may also remember things that were not so joyous in our lives in the past year. We rejoice in abundance, but we also know that this abundance is often limited. The oversupply, the amazing Australian gas reserves, but you may have read that about Australian gas production and its delivery in domestic and overseas markets, to know that that abundance can be subverted by poor economic mismanagement or self-interested entities or something. That abundance can be subverted. Or we may hear in the news that abundance is not the lot in many places in the world. The famine in South Sudan, the fighting in Syria and the Middle East, deprivation in Australian detention centres are just some examples of this. How do we include this ambiguity of abundance and shortage in our time of rejoicing and thanksgiving? With that question in mind, I turn to the Gospel reading for today. The reading from the Gospel for John is the set lectionary reading for this day. It's not a reading usually associated with harvest thanksgiving. Yet it does contain something for which to give thanks, and that is, of course, the gift of sight to the man who was born blind. I noted before that this miraculous part of the story takes only 7 out of 41 verses, and I wonder if it's fair to actually call it a healing story at all. In fact, to call it a healing suggests that somehow the man who was born blind was defective when he was blind, or that he was born defective. And it's a short step from that to suggest that in some way he was not fully human. At the start, the story talks about him being sinful or the result of sin. And that sounds like a pretty strong judgment that the blind man is imperfect by his very nature. Yet, I put against this the many examples of blind folk I've heard of or know who seem to me to be fine examples of what it means to be a human. In the history of music, for example, there are many cases of blind organists who've contributed excellent music to our traditions and spiritual worship to many over the years. I'd not say that such people were defective or less than human. And what's more, the book we're using for our Lenten studies this year, Learning to Walk in the Dark, shows repeatedly that sight is not the same as insight. Now, at this point, my reflection bumps into a shift in our understanding of disability in our culture. and of what it means to be disabled. The view of our culture is changing, moving away from the notion that disability implies imperfection to disability as differently abled, yet still to be valued as a human. And that's a good thing. The reality is that all of us eventually lose abilities, even those who appear to be the most abled of people. An accident can take away capacity in a flash, and as we age, abilities deteriorate: sight, hearing, mental cognition. That does not make us less than human. For to be human is not defined by what we do in ourselves, but externally, by the love of God towards us, the love echoed in the love of others towards us. I've digressed. Coming back to the gospel story, we see that although the man is physically blind, he's actually quite able. He's mentally agile. His responses to those who question him show a capable mind, astute, with insight into human nature, and not a little daring. He is smart and gutsy when he challenges the Pharisees. "Do you want to become his disciples also?" He replies to their repeated questions. That puts them on the back foot. Of course, his status in the eyes of God is made quite clear at the outset. The disciples assumed that the man's physical state had to be related to sin. Jesus rejects this out of hand. The man is that way to show the glory of God. By extension, we are the way we are, with our imperfections and our weaknesses, to show the glory of God too, in some way. So the man receives the gift of sight and becomes a follower of Jesus, praising God. We could well see him singing both of the psalms we have looked at this morning. Truly, the Lord has been his shepherd, and the gift of sight is on par with the acts of creation. Never since the world began, he says, has anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. The man stands in contrast to the Pharisees and the leaders of the Jews. And by the way, it's important to realize that when the Gospel of John uses the term Jews, he doesn't mean all Jews. That would be absurd because Jesus is a Jew, along with the disciples. No, John's Gospel means leaders of the Jews, those who may lose power and influence through the activity of Jesus. How did the leaders of the Jews respond to the gift of sight to the man? Not with thanksgiving. They sidelined the gift in order to denigrate Jesus and the man. Jesus heals on the Sabbath, so he cannot be from God. Jesus is unknown, so he cannot be from God. To which the man responds, "How can anything this marvelous happen from anywhere other than God?" The leaders claim to have insight through their training and traditions, but deny the good when it stands before them in plain sight. Why do they do this? It seems that for those leaders in this passage, it's not a matter of not recognizing the good. They are not blind to the good. They say so themselves. Rather, they do it out of self-interest. In this case, Jesus presents a threat to their status and power in society. For them, abundance is measured in influence and power, and is limited, or should be limited, they'd say, to themselves, as heirs of the knowledge and traditions of Moses. So they do not give praise and thanksgiving for the gift of sight to the man. And again, I need to say it's not all leaders of the Jews who are like this, because the Gospel of John have examples like Nicodemus, who is struggling to see who Jesus was. We have to be careful of easy generalizations. So let me tie these thoughts together. Firstly, today is a day when we acknowledge that good things do happen to us and to others. Today is a day when we can give thanks to God for those good things, for all the things that gives us life and love and community. And in doing so, we should expand our focus, not just reflecting on what is good for us, not just operating with narrow ideas of self-interest, but to expand, to consider what is good for others, to rejoice for them, with them, in thanksgiving when they are blessed, but also to take up a challenge. That blind man who was given sight becomes a follower of Jesus. How do we use our blessings to show love and concern for others? Amen.